Anna talks about going to a new therapist. The therapist is saying something about her ex, and she's like, when you're dealing with a wolf in sheep's clothing, and Anna interrupts her and is like, no, but like, what if I'm the wolf? What if I'm the one that was wrong the whole time?
There has been so much discussion about abuse in media lately. A ton of celebrities are coming forward and sharing their story to spread information about the prevalence of domestic violence. These types of discussions really matter because they prove abuse can happen to anyone. Last month, Anna Kendrick went on the Call Her Daddy podcast and discussed an abusive relationship she had endured. She spoke with such candor and vulnerability, pointing out how sometimes discussions about red flags can feel like victim blaming, how abuse doesn't always present in the same way, and how she never thought that this would happen to her. This is Unsilenced, a JBWS podcast where we have real conversations about abuse. I'm MC Robinson, and today we're speaking with
Maddie Hahn, and I manage our dating abuse prevention program.
Maddie and I both love pop culture and immediately wanted to discuss all elements of Anna Kendrick's episode, despite both being pretty sick at the time. So please excuse my raspy, congested voice. And before you watch, please take a moment to follow Unsilenced. It really helps us reach a wider audience. Okay, now on to the episode.
What did you think of Anna Kendrick's episode on Call Her Daddy? I thought it was incredible.
I wanted more. That was the thing I thought was I wanted to ask her questions myself. I wanted to hear more.
She talked about emotional abuse and abuse in general in such a different way than we hear, and even a different way that we've been talking about externally. One thing that resonated with me, I wrote it down. She said that her relationship didn't follow the traditional pattern of abuse. So when she was looking at all these articles and watching all these videos, she was like, okay, some of this fits, but not everything fits. I guess my question to you is, does abuse always present in the same way, or can it be different for each person?
It can be so different. And I think she had a beautiful way of speaking about that. And I think it speaks also to the experience of being in a relationship where there is abuse, because as she was looking for the signs, she's trying to read these articles, she's trying to see if her experience fits this narrative and this. She's also at the same time identifying ways she doesn't fit that criteria. So I think it speaks to that experience and what it feels like to be in an unsafe or a relationship with abuse, that even while trying to navigate resources, part of your brain is trying to figure out, oh, this can't be me. Like that, I don't fit this mold. So while it was also, her experience did feel different than what she was seeing, I think it also speaks to that experience of what it feels like to have that control and manipulation. And you are already trying to feel like, no, this isn't me. There's that sense of denial with it. And you don't want to identify with that.
Yeah, and I love what you're saying, because I think that's something that we really don't talk about enough, particularly the shame element of this, but also if your relationship doesn't exactly line up with how we've been talking about abuse externally, you see it on the podcast or social media, it doesn't mean that you're not experiencing abuse. Why isn't it always that easy to recognize?
I think so many reasons it's not that easy to recognize, but you can be in a relationship for a long time before this happens. This can happen in the very beginning. This isn't a situation where it's black and white. It's not very easy to see. I think relationships really live in that gray area. So I think it's just not that easy for people to always see what is happening, what we're feeling, what we're experiencing. And Anna talked about this as well when she said, like, there's good things too. And she did like and love this person as well. So that is another kind of shield on our ability to kind of see what's going on in these other experiences, because often we do still like that person. There's good things about this person in that relationship as well. So I feel like she was talking about that a lot through her conversation as well.
And it's almost like you don't want it to be true. You know what I mean? Like, as you said a little bit earlier, she's looking for all the ways that it doesn't fit, because I think it's difficult to fully embrace like this is happening and to want to accept that. Another thing that she said, even the most well-meaning conversations about red flags can be a little victim blaming because it does sort of put the onus on you to be able to identify something that someone is working so hard to make sure you can't identify. I thought the way she described that was absolutely incredible. So, what do you think of that perspective?
I loved how she spoke about that as well, and just kind of reflecting on, we want to have these conversations, we want to talk about red flags, we want to talk about warning signs, but how does that feel and what do we do with that when we have that information? And as soon as I heard that, I started thinking about, okay, when I'm having these conversations in the classroom and there are folks sitting there who may be identifying with this going on in their relationships, and we're talking about red flags and warning signs, how does it feel to try to identify that? Like, does that feel like a sense of blame? That's something I would love to ask more survivors, that question. Did it make you feel like almost responsible to that you should have identified that sooner? And I feel like, to me, that's what I heard Anna talking about a lot, is she almost had this expectation on herself that she should have been able to identify this. She should have known. And she didn't. And I think that her reflection on that in itself, her saying, I should have known, I should have seen this. How did I not notice that? I think that really speaks to what it is like to be in a relationship that there is abuse.
Yep.
As you don't always know.
And also how she was referencing that everything that's done is also to make it so that you have difficulty identifying it. And one of the strongest quotes that I think Anna said during this was she was likening it to somebody being dropped in the middle of like the wilderness, and how like if you were a wilderness survivalist, you would have prepared for this and you could navigate the traps and figure your way out. But if she's just dropped there, she would immediately fall into a booby trap because she didn't spend her life learning how to build or identify traps. And I thought just like that metaphor was just so incredible, because it is really difficult to be asked to get into the mind of somebody that's using abuse. And I've never considered it from that perspective, where a victim might feel it's on me to recognize it. It's on me because I didn't spend my whole life learning how to build and identify traps, to use Anna's language. If you wouldn't mind, like, go into a little bit further why emotional abuse in particular is so hard to identify and isn't something that somebody should feel shame about that they can't identify.
I think it can be really hard to identify because also unhealthy things can happen in healthy relationships. Like, we can also have moments and we can reflect on it and we could talk to our partner and be like, whoa, that, like, we can talk about those things. So relationships are on a spectrum, and there are relationships that someone is using abuse. There's really, really healthy, great relationships. There's unhealthy, right? There's somewhere in between. So I think it can be really hard to identify because there's a point where it turns and someone is trying to gain and maintain power and control. And that's where it gears towards someone using abuse in a relationship. Not to say that we should stay in a relationship with all these unhealthy moments either, but it is on a spectrum when we're talking about where these things kind of lie and how they make us feel in this power and control dynamic. I think emotional abuse really can lay on that spectrum a little bit more. I think when we talk about physical abuse, it can be a little bit more direct in front of our face, where we can identify a physical harm to ourselves. Socially, culturally, we're a little bit more to call that what it is. That is a physical harm to my body or this person's body.
Because you can see it a lot of times.
There's not a lot of self-negotiation you can have with that. Of course, you could tell yourself or someone else it was an accident or something like that, but it's a little bit more concrete. But some of these emotional things, I think the partner can do a good job of making you feel, right, using that gaslighting, making you feel part of that situation. And I forget what Anna's language was, but there was one moment when she was reflecting on when she called the therapist afterwards because she finally, in her words, felt like she was using her voice or she got loud, and her therapist was happy that she kind of like recognized that. And that almost seemed like a little bit of a moment where she was like, whoa, like it wasn't like, it seemed like a little bit of an eye-opening moment for her. she kind of realized her voice in that situation as well.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing that I thought was really interesting, and it made me think of it when we mentioned the therapist, was
Mm-hmm.
the reflection on the first therapist that they were working with who wasn't able to identify it as
Mm-hmm.
a relationship with abuse. What did you think of that part? Because I thought it was powerful to be in the field of social work, but to also have that reflection on a therapist.
Yeah, I mean, I think Alex Cooper said, or maybe it was Anna, but they said that we project so much authority onto a
Yeah.
therapist and that sometimes they can be wrong. They're human beings. And I think this speaks to why it's so imperative to have a therapist that understands domestic violence. To use Anna's terminology, she said the first therapist that they saw together fell for his side, hook, line, and sinker. So he was just kind of convinced of her partner's side. And so, why is it so important to have a therapist that understands the dynamics of abuse instead of just like saying maybe they should go to marriage counseling? Like, why is it so important to have that DV lens?
I think it's also important to have that individual lens in that moment, to have that one-on-one therapy and not
Yes.
just the couples therapy when something like this is going on. And Anna was researching, she was having these questions. So a little piece of her, also, I wish I could tell her like a piece of you did start to know. Like, I think she talked
Yes.
about it with like a lot of shame. And I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
you did know. You were looking at articles.
Mm-hmm.
Not that you knew completely, but you had this like feeling that it was off. And I feel like trusting your gut is such a real thing in that moment. Like something is telling
Mm-hmm.
you that this is off. Maybe you don't know what to call it. Maybe you don't know what to name it. You're not sure what's going on, but like your gut is searching for answers because you know something's off. So I think like for listeners in this moment, I would, if you found yourself in a position like Anna, where you're not necessarily saying there's abuse in this relationship, but you're unsure of how you
Mm-hmm.
feel in navigating this relationship, I think there is such an importance of getting that individual therapy as well at that
Mm-hmm.
time, to make sure you have someone to just talk to your lens, your experience, and your side of this without that other person in the space with you.
Mm-hmm.
Because even that same therapist, maybe if Anna was meeting with them one on one, maybe they would have
Yes.
seen the situation a little bit differently. Even if that therapist doesn't have that DV lens and expertise,
Yeah.
I think just having that moment outside of this
Mm.
couples space kind of sounded important to me in that moment.
Yeah.
But also, it is so hugely important if there is DV in the relationship and you do know that, to seek a counselor who does have this expertise and this experience, because it is such a big topic. There's so much to know about it. And
Mm-hmm.
I always, whenever I'm talking to students about this in the classroom too, I always say, think about it. There are so many wonderful and great counselors and clinicians, and there's so many great, wonderful doctors. But
Yes.
at the same time, there is also heart surgeons and brain surgeons and
Mm-hmm.
pediatricians and family doctors and women's health doctors, right? There's all these different zones. And just because they're a physician doesn't mean that the heart doctor knows what the brain doctor knows about the brain. So
Yes.
I think it's important to look at it that way when we're talking about clinicians as well, that everyone has their own lane of expertise, whether it's anxiety, grief, depression, trauma, right? Therapists specialize in different things. And I think that that's a really good way to think about it, that
Mm-hmm.
just like you wouldn't want a brain surgeon operating on your heart, you
Mm-hmm.
would want to go to someone who knows a lot about DV to help you navigate that.
And because it's so nuanced too, right? So there's so much and when we say DV, I keep doing this, but we mean domestic violence. But there's so much there that I think is really hard to understand because I mean, the purpose of this is that a lot of people don't know about domestic violence. They don't know the cycle of violence. They don't know all of these factors that play into abuse. So when you're seeing somebody and they don't know that, how could they possibly be able to recognize the signs? You know what I mean? So it's like it just kind of sets you up for a difficult situation. And later on, Anna talks about going to a new therapist, right? The therapist is saying something about her ex, and she's like, when you're dealing with a wolf in sheep's clothing, and Anna interrupts her and is like, no, but like, what if I'm the wolf? What if I'm the one that was wrong the whole time? And I think if you don't have a therapist that has knowledge of domestic violence, you could potentially reinforce the idea that you are the problem. But I think in general, this victim blaming or the self-blaming is so common in abusive relationships. And like, why is that?
I think that speaks to how the person using abuse has made you feel in that relationship. It is a visual of that abuse that has occurred that you then so deeply feel gaslighted, or that you're part of the problem because of the power and control dynamics and how things have been happening in the relationship. I think it's it's a mirror of the abuse that has been occurring, that even after time, that person sits there and says, well, what if it is me?
And she even said that she felt almost shame for not knowing that it wasn't her. And, you know, we're going to actually have another whole podcast episode about emotional abuse. But I think there's so much power in what she said specifically because of the way she described it. One thing that really resonated is that Anna was talking about how she's a strong woman and she never thought this would happen to her. And she couldn't understand how she got into this position. And she said, you know, anyone would have asked me this and I would have said to them, I'd throw a scarf over my shoulder and say, have a nice life. But it's something she didn't do when it came down to it.
I loved when she said that. I
right?
loved that.
Tell me why.
I just thought any person who is watching this who felt similarly or who really identified with feeling a strong person, I would absolutely walk away from this situation. I think any person who also felt that and then is also in an unhealthy or a relationship with abuse now, I was like, oh my gosh, that could speak to so many people that said that. It was such a powerful moment and very vulnerable for her to reflect on how strong she identified and that she thought that this could no way be her. I think it just speaks to how most people, we don't think that until you're in that moment and it's happening. And then you're like, what do I do?
Yes. And this is so much more common than we think. I had a friend once that I remember was in a terribly abusive relationship. And I remember her saying at the end of it, I just didn't think this would happen to me. And that is something that until you experience it, you're always going to think, I don't think this could happen to me. When Anna says, but this is somebody they are working very hard to make you feel this way and it's not by accident. I think that is so powerful because it takes the blame away from you and this like feeling like why did I allow this to happen? And really say like, no, they're working so you don't realize what's happening and making you question yourself. That's literally what their behavior is designed to do in a way. Can you talk about how some abusive tactics work to make you doubt yourself or your reality or that abuse is even happening at all?
I think there are so many different ways to have that conversation, but I think a lot, even like isolation, for example, we can look at isolation and say from the outside, okay, it's just you being kind of pulled away from family and friends. But it's not just that. It's a lot bigger than that. It's being pulled away from family and friends and your job and your hobbies and your sports and your schoolwork or anything else that's important to you. When you look at something like that, if someone is working so hard, slowly or quickly, to pull away all these other things from your life and make your world smaller, it's not like you notice the first time if someone says to you like, oh, don't spend time with them tonight. Like I really wanted to hang out. It was just going to be you. Because that can also feel good. You're like, oh, my partner really wants to spend time.
I'm special. Yeah.
Right. I'm special. I'm loved. You want to have this one-on-one time with me. We feel good at first. And then there's this where you're like, maybe this doesn't feel good. Or when you kind of reflect and like look at the picture of all the things like you've been pulled away from and connects with like what Anna said in terms of it doesn't happen just if you look at the big picture. And Anna did say a little bit, I believe she said that she felt like it did happen overnight. Anna knows her experience the best. She is the expert in her experience and always will be. But when she said the comment about the light switch, I do think the way she said it like just happened could kind of make listeners feel like there was nothing going on and then all of a sudden all the behaviors switched. And again, I cannot speak to her experience and what happened. I was not there. I do not know. But I think it's likely to assume that there were these unhealthy and controlling elements happen. And then
Yeah.
it felt like a light switch of her noticing. Like all of a sudden,
Mm,
it felt like the lights were turned on for her to see all this. But
mm,
I feel like likely there were always these kind of undertones of like manipulation and control and some elements happening that maybe didn't feel like abuse or would be identified in that
hmm.
way. That's kind of why we have these conversations and talk
Yeah.
about red flags and we talk about warning signs, because there likely were some red flags and warning signs if we could go back. And I would love to be able to ask Anna if she could go back, if you could kind of see into there. While it felt like a light switch when
Mm,
you noticed, were there any pockets, were there any moments of time where you kind of saw the door crack open?
mm.
That's where we want to try to get people to notice these moments.
That's really interesting because she also spoke about how she felt like the relationship was perfect for 6 years and she had so much love and trust for this person that going into it, when there was problems, she was like, well, it must be me. Like if anyone's
Yeah.
crazy, it must be me. You wanted to touch upon how victimhood was used, and how Anna Kendrick's ex really felt the pain of this, and how she pointed out that he had an emotional response. So just wondering more of your thoughts on that, because she said that at a certain point he was like, Anna, I'm begging you, you're ruining everything, and they're so convinced that you're the one that's doing something terrible, which can be very misleading. So what do you think about that?
I just thought it was very powerful how she was still, even though she experienced abuse from this person,
Yeah.
she looked at them as a human being as well. And she was like, they were experiencing pain. And
Mm,
I just think it really kind of goes along with our shift in language of how we are talking about domestic violence and
yeah.
not calling someone an abuser, but reflecting that this is a person using abuse in a relationship. And the way she spoke about that really
Mm.
made me feel like she's kind of shifting the language too.
Yeah, and I also think another element of this, or the flip side, is that they could be experiencing real pain and still be abusing you. That doesn't excuse it either. They can have the full range
100%.
of human emotions and acknowledge that they could be in pain too, and still know that their behavior is a problem. So it's like holding that duality, which is
Yeah.
difficult. Thank you, Maddie, for coming on the podcast and speaking with me about this topic. I think it's so important for us to explore how abuse is being talked about in media and in current events. You were able to contextualize some of the information Anna shared, which was really invaluable. Above all else, I think Anna's episode on Call Her Daddy really highlighted that any person can experience abuse, even if you think it could never happen to you. Thank you for listening to this episode of Unsilenced, Real Conversations about Abuse. This podcast is produced by JBWS, a domestic violence agency serving Morris County, New Jersey. Please let us know what topics you would like covered on this podcast by sending an email to podcast@jbws.org. Please note that this email address is only intended for content relating to the podcast. It is not meant to offer immediate assistance or access to services. If you live or work in Morris County and think you might be in an unhealthy relationship, JBWS is here to help. Please visit our website at jbws.org to learn more about our services, or call our 24-hour helpline to speak to members of our staff at 1-877-782-2873. If you recognize controlling or abusive behaviors in yourself, JBWS can also help change those behaviors. Through our Jersey Center for Nonviolence, JBWS offers programs for men, women, and adolescent males who have used abusive or controlling behaviors in their relationships. Please visit jbws.org/JCNV or call 973-539-7801 to learn more. If you don't live in Morris County, please call the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-7233. Domestic violence grows in silence, so thank you so much for listening and helping us break through that silence
through these types of conversations. Please follow us on social media and continue to share our content to get as many people talking about domestic abuse as possible.